18 years after she went missing in Portugal, a new search for evidence is launched in the case of Madeleine McCann. We'll discuss what's happening in this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, but today I'm thinking back to my time in the Newsround studio on CBBC, and particularly the summer of 2007, when there was one story the entire world was talking about, and it was a really emotional one because it was the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. She was 3 years old. She was on holiday with her siblings, her parents and their friends in a holiday club called the Ocean Club in Praia de Luz in Portugal. And one night she just went missing, and then the entire world was captivated for various reasons about the search for her. And actually, her parents have never given up looking for her, and they've lobbied previous governments to restart the investigation. And then a few years ago, the German police said that they now had a new suspect, this guy called Christian Bruckner, who was actually in prison for another crime. And then today, we got a big development, a really quite large search being conducted by the German and Portuguese police just a few miles away from the resort where Madeleine McCann and her family were staying. So let's remind ourselves about the case and find out what's going on today, because we're joined by our colleague who's there on the ground in Portugal right now watching it all unfold. It's Daniel Sandford. Hi, Daniel.
Hi there, Adam.
And also joining us now is BBC News presenter Jane Hill, who I remember very, very well reporting on this for Rolling News when it first happened in 2007. Hello, Jane.
Yes, hi Adam, hello.
So Daniel, do you want to just explain to us what's actually been going on today, what we know about it?
Yeah, the German police have arrived here in force yesterday, and today began in earnest a fresh set of searches. Just before about 8:30 this morning, we saw a convoy of four German police vehicles. They were German registered vehicles driving into an area that had already been sealed off by Portuguese police, and the area is just above the coastal walk that runs between Praia de Luz and Lagos, which is the next resort heading east along the Atlantic coast. And when we made our way into that search area along the coastal path, we came across the German police, and they are searching quite vigorously around a ruined building which we could see on the horizon. They were digging away at the undergrowth, collecting stuff out of the undergrowth. A couple of 100 metres away from there, they'd set up a base with a large blue tent, which we've seen before on German searches in the Algarve. And then a couple of 100 metres again on beyond there, there was a Portuguese fire engine which appeared to be pumping out a well as part of the searches, and we had been told that the police would not only be searching ruined buildings but would also be looking in old wells and water tanks. So that was the first day of the search, focusing, as far as we could see, on two particular buildings, but we've got 3 more days of searching before the week is out.
And Daniel, what you just described there, the format of the search, do you think that reveals anything about what the police are doing?
Well, it is quite targeted. It was a little unclear when this search was announced as whether they were just going to completely search across a whole area, but it does seem to be quite targeted on these old buildings. That might tell us that the police have got some specific intelligence, that they may find something linked to Madeleine McCann's disappearance at an old building or in a water tank or well linked to an old building. But it equally could just be that those are the obvious places to search. When you've chosen that search area, you can't search the entire bit of gorse scrubland, and clearly the places where someone's most likely to hide something might be in those ruined buildings. So it might tell us something, but there's no guarantee, as is so often the truth in this story.
And then Daniel, just help us understand this potential link with this German man, Christian Bruckner, who's actually in prison for serving a sentence for another crime, but who has become the prime suspect in Madeleine's disappearance.
Yeah, Christian Bruckner is a man who spent a lot of time in the Algarve area in the early 2000s, committing petty crime and certainly at least one very serious sexual assault. He's serving a prison sentence for raping an elderly American woman in Praia de Luz in 2005. So that was a couple of years before Madeleine McCann disappeared. That prison sentence is now coming to an end. The earliest release date would be September, the latest release date sometime in early 2026. And around 2020, German prosecutors in the town of Braunschweig said that they believed that they had a man that they described as a suspect, not in the investigation into Madeleine McCann's disappearance, but an investigation into her murder. And they said that was based on information that they've received, which has sometimes been described as a tip-off from somebody that says that Christian Bruckner told them that he'd been involved in Madeleine McCann's death, though obviously that's never been tested in court in any way. But ever since 2020, the German police have been in the lead on the investigation into her disappearance. They came here a couple of years ago to search in a reservoir that was often frequented by Christian Bruckner. But this week there is this really quite specific search in this scrubland just above the coastal path between Praia de Luz and Lagos. And some people think this might be a little bit of a sort of desperate last stab by the German investigation to try and get some physical evidence to back up the intelligence which they say they have. But of course, as I previously said, it might be that they've actually got some quite good leads to go on, and they're acting on those leads, trying to just get the last bit of evidence. And I guess we won't learn this week, but I guess we'll learn in the weeks to come which of these it is.
And Jane, take us back to those days in 2007 when Madeleine McCann first went missing, and this just became a huge international news story. It felt like the entire world was invested in it.
Yes, extraordinary, wasn't it? And those of us who were there covering it also ourselves couldn't really believe that it was of so much interest to people all over the world. I got there, as you say, the day after it had emerged that she had disappeared, that Madeleine had disappeared. I remember getting to the police tape. Well, Daniel's been standing there over the last couple of days, that whole area right by the Ocean Club in Praia de Luz, and we got to the police tape. There was only one other broadcast journalist already there. And for quite a few days, there was some Portuguese media interest, of course, but it built and built. And then within a week, and then 2 weeks, and then 3 weeks, the crowd of journalists in that little town just grew and grew and grew. And it was extraordinary, isn't it? It's very strange how sometimes a story just, for all the wrong reasons, of course, and I hate to use this phrase, but capture the public imagination really took root. And this is before social media was anything like what it is today. And I remember as the crowds of journalists grew and grew at the police tape, as far as we were as close as we were allowed to get to the Ocean Club apartment that they'd been renting. And one day I realized a Japanese TV crew had turned up, and I said, I'm not being rude. I mean, this is incredibly sad. For a British family, this is a very sad story. But why is a Japanese audience interested in this? I don't get it. And he said, everyone in Japan is following this story, so we have to be here. And not many of us, I think, have worked on a story that grew and grew to quite that degree when you are purely talking about a specific British family. I mean, heartbreaking as it all absolutely was at the time. We couldn't believe how many journalists were there within a couple of weeks.
And you talk about the McCann family. This was a family holiday. Madeleine McCann was there with her siblings, her parents, Kate and Jerry, some of their friends, their children, just having a very nice, up until that point, Portuguese holiday in this apartment complex.
And I think don't we all think that's why it hit home? Because Portugal, sunshine, beach. How many British families, if they can afford it, don't want to just escape the pressures of work, disappear to the beautiful sunshine, those lovely coastlines, have a week away, get away from work, hang out with your friends, go to a resort where there's swimming pools for children, tennis activities for children, perfect holiday for families. And I think that was part of it. We all talked about it at the time. Just that sense of, oh my God, that could have been me. That could have been any family. And I think certainly for anyone listening to this podcast who maybe is a lot younger than me, doesn't remember perhaps the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, you can't overstate actually the extent to which for weeks and months afterwards you could be in any social situation and someone would say, oh my God, would we have done that? Could we have done that? That could have been us. It's exactly the sort of place we'd like to go on holiday if we could.
Yeah.
It was coming up to a bank holiday weekend that she disappeared, a couple of days before the bank holiday. So you're in that sort of mindset, thinking about holidays. If you're not going away for the bank holiday, maybe you're thinking about booking your summer holiday. And everyone just felt, well, so many people felt, oh my goodness, that could have been my family.
And Daniel, we've been talking about the investigation today, but the investigation then by the Portuguese police was very controversial at the time.
It was, and no one's really covered themselves in glory over the years, it has to be said. The Portuguese investigation, they later conceded, just hadn't realised the enormity of it straight away. They hadn't properly forensically sealed off the apartment. They hadn't done the early forensic work. I'm not quite sure what they thought had happened, but they somehow didn't seem to grasp that it was likely that Madeleine McCann had been abducted and what the risks that meant for her were. Then at one point they actually made Madeleine McCann's parents as sort of formal suspects, which meant that they could be sort of interviewed under caution, as it were, in the English legal system parallels, and that was obviously immensely controversial. The Portuguese prosecutor who ran that investigation then wrote a book, wrote all sorts of horrendous things about the McCanns. Then the British police got involved at the urging of David Cameron, who was then Prime Minister, and quite a lot of money's been spent on the British investigation, and it went off in all various directions, but never really settled on anything really concrete, though it does seem as if the German lead might have come out of that British investigation. It was really only when the Germans got involved and they had this really, really good lead that people started looking at, well, whose phones were where in the resort at the time, which people hanging around the resort at the time might have had a history of criminality, a history of sexual offending. And then that's when this sort of pattern of behaviour linked to Christian Bruckner kind of hardened up, and clearly, you know, they still haven't got sufficient evidence to charge him, and they may never have, and he completely denies any involvement in her disappearance. But it was 13 years almost after her disappearance that all that started happening. And of course, you know, loyalties change over time, and sometimes that's how these cases are resolved. But it really, really hasn't been any great triumph by anybody. And I was speaking to a lady who this evening who was living above the apartment where Madeleine McCann disappeared in Ocean Club at the time, and she came down and said, you know, you guys are here again. It's kind of like it's every year that the news teams turn up. And she just said, I just hope that poor family gets some closure. And I think that's, you know, a lot of the British people who live around here, that's really their feeling now. They've probably gone through the process of hating the media presence and wishing the media didn't turn up every year. And now they're kind of thinking, well, here they are again, but, you know, when are that poor family going to get some closure?
And
Yes.
Jane, you did the first TV interview with Kate and Jerry, Madeleine's parents, and we can play a little clip of that now, and then I'll get your thoughts on it all these years later.
And how do you aim to keep that strength and that positive outlook that we've seen you express to the media a lot in the last 3 weeks, and that sense that life will continue, that what you said publicly to us a few weeks ago, that you believe and have to believe that Madeleine is somewhere being looked after by someone. How do you hold on to that thought?
No, absolutely. We must continue with that, and we do believe it. You know, I think if anything really bad had happened, we would have found her by now. So I think, you know, and I'm confident and believe this strongly that we will find her. It's not hard to continue believing that. She's our daughter. We love her more than anyone can possibly imagine. And, you know, the alternative would be giving up, and we will not give up our search.
Okay, nodding throughout all of that.
Absolutely, yeah. We need to believe that she's coming back to us.
Oh, that's actually quite heartbreaking hearing now, kind of echoing through history.
Oh my goodness. I mean, Adam, I haven't heard that for years and years and years. And that sent shivers,
Mm,
actually. That was, I mean, it's not about me in any way, shape, or form, but that was one of probably the hardest interview actually I've ever had to do, because how do you, even though they had willingly agreed to the interview because
mm,
they wanted to keep Madeleine absolutely in the public eye, the, I never thought I'd be in a position where you walk, me and the small team that I was working with would walk into a room, and before the cameras start rolling, you have to speak to two people in such chronic pain,
mm.
in such pain, and just, oh, it gives me shivers just thinking about it. Just on a human level, I wasn't worried about the journalistic side of it. I was so steeped
Mm,
in the story, I knew there was plenty to talk about, but on a human level, just, I mean, the pain, you can hear it in their
mm,
voices. Not surprisingly, you could see it on their faces. Even though they wanted to talk, they wanted her photo out there, they wanted their daughter's photo out there for us all to remember and look out for her. That was one of their key themes at the time. But I just remember feeling so anxious going in,
mm,
thinking, I mean, what would you say, even if it was a friend of yours? If this had happened
mm,
to a friend of yours who'd gone on holiday with 3 children and were facing the prospect of potentially going home with 2 children? I
mm.
mean, what would we say in any circumstance?
And of course, Jane, it was complicated by what Daniel was saying a minute ago, but about the Portuguese police making them technically suspects at one point.
Yes, that came a bit later. That particular interview that you
Mm,
just played the clip of was before that happened.
mm,
Um, but I certainly would echo what Daniel said about the initial investigation, and when he talked about, for example, the apartment that they had rented wasn't sealed off. I mean, there were elements of the investigation that the British journalists in particular were all absolutely, frankly, gobsmacked. The notion that a child had disappeared and you wouldn't seal off an area because potentially it was a crime scene. I mean, that was the talk of all the British journalists, broadcast, print. People were absolutely stunned. People were just walking in and out, not journalists, but other people had been allowed to just walk in and out of that apartment where the 3 children had been sleeping, and where Madeleine was last seen. And there were many elements of that investigation that were extraordinary to British eyes at the
mm.
time.
And Daniel, Kate and Jerry McCann, I mean, they stayed true to their word. They have not given up, and they have campaigned to keep the investigation into their daughter's disappearance going, while at the same time sort of trying to protect themselves and their other children from the limelight.
Yeah, I mean, they've taken an interesting approach, which is they won't engage on every twist and turn in the story. You know, you won't see them giving interviews about this search this week. They realise that they don't really achieve, while obviously there was very good reasons at the time that she'd first disappeared to keep the story in the headlines, they don't really achieve anything by doing that now, and they've tried to keep their family life running as normally as possible. But they do every year write on the anniversary of her disappearance that they're still thinking about her, that they will carry on fighting, and we know that in the background they're still very much kept abreast by their British police liaison officers about all the developments internationally. And you know, the little twin brother and sister that was sleeping in the room with her that night, they're now adults. Madeleine McCann has just had her 22nd birthday last month. So, you know, an awful lot has happened in that family since. And yet her face, you know, for everyone in the world, and of course for her family, is sort of frozen in time just before her 4th birthday.
Mm. Daniel, thank you very much for keeping us up to date.
No problem.
And Jane, thanks to you too.
Thanks very much, Adam. Thank you. And I think we would all echo what Daniel's just said there about the woman who said to him, "I just wish there could be closure for that poor family." I think there's a lot of people who feel that way in Portugal and in Britain.
Now, we're going to have a little European political update because there have been quite a lot of goings on in European politics this week. We're going to focus on what's happened in the Netherlands on Tuesday afternoon because their government has collapsed, and the election of a new president in Poland, which happened over the weekend. all of which are very significant. And the person who's going to draw all these threads together, welcome back from the Brexit cast golden days, is Dr. Katya Adler, who's in Brussels. Hello, Katya.
Hello.
We're going to have a bit of a Brexit cast reunion because some of the characters we were reporting on then are kind of players in the stories that we're going to talk about now. So let's talk about the Dutch government first. And, the Dutch government's just collapsed.
Yeah, it has. It's collapsed. And I think what most strikes me about its collapse is that it sounds dramatic, doesn't it? But if you look at the Dutch media, they're not that bothered about it. And that could be because it's been around since July last year, so not even a year. And there's been so much infighting because Dutch governments, well, you see this across a lot of Europe actually because of the electoral systems and splits in society. But it had 4 parties in it and they couldn't agree on stuff. So it's not as if there's been fantastic decision making for the Dutch public. And so it's collapsed and we expect a new election in September.
And what was the cause of the collapse?
Well, it depends who you ask. So it was provoked by, and I think you were referring to when you said their characters, we used to talk about Geert Wilders, which newscasters may remember him. He's got that shock of, dyed white blonde hair. He's known for extreme anti-Islam rhetoric, some of which he had to drop in order to make this coalition, which, by the way, so it basically survived 10 months, but it took 6 months to make it. I mean, that's why the people in the Netherlands are rolling their eyes. But he's the biggest party in the coalition government. And he's just made a whole list of demands last week on migration. He is known as, this massive anti-immigration candidate. And he basically said, well, if you can't agree to all of these, I'm out. So the kind of things he was asking for, he wanted to put the Dutch army on the borders of the Netherlands to protect the borders. He wanted to freeze asylum applications. He wanted to close refugee accommodation and send home many Syrian refugees because he argues their homeland is now safe after the fall of Bashar al-Assad. And his coalition partners say, well, look, we agreed with some of these things and other ones we had legal concerns, but there was absolutely no need to collapse the government. So a lot of people think it was cynical because, the danger of going into coalition government is very easy to be a firebrand in opposition, but when you're in government and you're not actually doing things to make people's lives much better, and as I say, this has not been a very efficient government, you go down in the polls. And that is exactly what happened to Geert Wilders and his party. And so critics say, well, he's just purposefully ended this government so he can call another election. And he's gone on X and said, I'm going to be the next prime minister of the Netherlands. And he's hoping by collapsing the government over migration, one assumes, that migration is going to be the topic that leads in the election that, as I say, we're expecting to be called in September. But yeah, I mean, his coalition partners are just saying, they're saying he's, super irresponsible. This wasn't about asylum at all. He's betraying the Netherlands. And these were his coalition partners.
And I wonder if this is an opportunity for another Brexit cast bit player, Frans Timmermans, who was vice president of the European Commission during that period. And he's basically the main opposition leader now in the Netherlands.
Yes, so he's on the centre left, but he'll have a hard job. I mean, Geert Wilders has posted on X a poll that he says shows that the Dutch want Islam banned in their country. Now, I'm sure you can have polls to say all sorts of things, and as we know in polls, it depends how you phrase a question to the people who are asked. But definitely, the fact that I'm sounding a bit cynical about this government collapsing and saying that the Dutch are rolling their eyes, not rolling their eyes because everything's rosy in their country. They have lots of things that they want changed in their country. Housing is a massive issue, which Wilders blamed on migration and an influx of migration. But there's all sorts of problems in the Netherlands and voters want it dealt with. I'm not sure they necessarily will go to Frans Timmermans. I think he's seen very much as an old, and not just in years, sorry, Mr. Timmermans, but, sort of yesteryear politicians with old-fashioned responses. He's very sort of pro-green also in his agenda. And we can see right across Europe that as voters worry about the cost of living, for example, the idea of a green revolution has taken a really big hit because it's expensive. So I don't know whether this means that he will win or whether he'll be able to be part of another coalition party. You can imagine if and when an election is called, that everybody will be hot on that campaign trail, and I do expect him to be there. That's for sure. But right now, if you're Dutch, you feel like you've got lots of issues in your country. You've had what many think is useless government, in the last 10 months, and I don't think they're feeling very optimistic about politics in general in their country right now.
Yeah, and then let's hop across Europe and look at a different country, Poland, which has got a new president, and everyone is talking about him.
Yes, Karol Nawrocki. He is an ultra-conservative populist candidate, really. I can say he likes a good slogan or two. He stands in support of the former government in Poland, the Law and Justice Party, ultra-conservative nationalist, very Eurosceptic. And the reason that I mentioned that party, I'll come back to in a moment. As a candidate himself, I think it tells you a lot about the Trump administration as well, because it's so interesting. We often hear Donald Trump described as protectionist, America first, only thinking about America. But for an administration that might define itself that way, they've certainly spent a lot of time talking about and opining on European politics, like before the German election, when they were advocating that German voters gave their support to the AfD party. And here, just before the second round of the Polish presidential election, you had Trump's head of Homeland Security, Christine Num, in Poland saying Nawrocki is the guy, and suggesting that if he became president, he would govern Poland in a style very similar to Donald Trump's. And in the crowd there was a CPAC conference basically in Poland. You had people with red caps saying "Make Poland great again." The thing is, the president is largely ceremonial as a role in Poland and has nothing to do with foreign policy. But it is a big influence. And I think what we've seen in the presidential election is how divided Poland is, how divided so many European countries are at the moment. So what you've got a prime minister who's, he's centre-right, I'd say, but he's pro-EU. He wants to work with European countries to make Europe more independent from the United States when it comes for defence, for example, very pro-Ukraine. Now you have a president who he's anti-Russia and very Russia-skeptic, but he's not too keen on Ukraine. He's said that he's going to put Polish interests above those of all of the Ukrainian refugees in Poland, that if it came to it, he would block Ukraine's membership of NATO. And he's very, very, very anti-EU. So I think, why does this matter? It matters because Poland these days is a very big player in Europe. And when I say Europe, I don't mean EU only. I mean Europe, because you see the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, working with European partners on matters of defence, in support of Ukraine, for example. And Poland is one of those big countries. And it's a big spender. It is the biggest spender in terms of national income in NATO. So by the end of this year, it's going to be spending 4.7% of GDP, it says. And that's why Poland matters. And so a divided Poland, a distracted Poland, will make an impact on the European stage more broadly.
And the Polish Prime Minister you were referring to there was another Brexit cast player, Donald Tusk, who was president of the council in that period and a deliverer of many a Brexit zinger. It's quite hard to sum up what this really means for Poland, doesn't it? Because they still seem pretty committed to defending Ukraine. Actually, there's an argument that having a sort of Trump sympathizer in quite a senior position in quite a pivotal country is kind of a good thing. But then equally, as you said, it's like if Poland is less of a reliable kind of player on the EU, that's going to have repercussions on an EU level. So it's such a mixed bag. It's not, you can't sort of categorize it as just one thing or the other.
No, it isn't. But that's always, that's me. It's shades of grey, not black and white. It's never that clear cut. But I think if you think back to Germany, so the biggest economy in Europe, and even though it's spluttering, it's still a massive economy, hugely influential on the EU and the wider European stage. And when we've had a general election in February, but for ages before that, a year and a half before that, there was so much bickering going on between the coalition partners, like we've just been talking about in the Netherlands, that other partners in Europe were saying, Germany, hello, there's all sorts of things happening in Europe, like a big war, and we're worried that even if and when the war ends in Ukraine, that Russia will turn its attention elsewhere because it's not stopping its economy being on a war footing, so it's going to want to do something with all that weaponry. And Germany was just distracted. And Poland has become this very, very important player when it comes to defence, inside NATO, inside the EU, working very closely with the new German Chancellor, for sure, and with France as well, and then more broadly in Europe with the United Kingdom. So it does matter what happens to Poland if it is distracted. And essentially, what this big split means now between the President and the Prime Minister is the country is kind of now already in a general election campaign. I mean, it'll hold one in 2027, if not before, for political reasons in the country. But you've got those two main parties, the Law and Justice Party behind the President, and Donald Tusk and his party, that are now going to be trying to outscore on one another. And in the meantime, like in the Netherlands, the polls are stuck because Donald Tusk was elected with a big reform agenda. If we look at domestic policies, for example, more rights for the LGBTQ plus community in Poland, easing the really strict anti-abortion laws in Poland, and bringing Poland back more into the EU fold. But with the president, even though he can't make laws, he can veto them. Or he can refer them to the Polish judiciary, and the Polish judiciary, which Donald Tusk would like to reform, and he's going to have that blocked, is mainly dominated by ultra-conservative judges. So you can see why, even though it doesn't mean one particular thing for Poland, what it does mean is it's like it's got its feet stuck in the mud. And even though the president is still supporting Ukraine, as you say, it's more he supports action against Russia. So he sees Russia as the aggressor. And just think, I mean, Poland is on Ukraine's doorstep. It has been the linchpin for NATO allies to get all their weaponry through into Ukraine. I mean, it's an estimated 95% of military aid has gone through that hub in Poland's southeast on its way into Ukraine. But for Poles, it's also existential for them because, like I say, they think that Russia is on an expansionist drive. And that means that Vladimir Putin, they believe, isn't just looking at Ukraine. But if he wins in Ukraine, or if he perceives to have won in Ukraine, then he could turn his attention elsewhere to Poland and other countries in Europe's east. So the president kind of fits into that mold, against Russia, but not pro-Ukraine.
And Katya, I've just realised this is our first joint appearance on Newscast since the UK and the EU signed their reset deal. Except I can imagine you'll say, oh, it's not a deal. It was an agreement to do some deals. Back to the old days.
Do you have an hour to talk about it? I think it was significant. I do. I think symbolically it was really big to have this summit because the tone is so different to when you and I were sitting together in the Brexit Cast studio. We have moved on. This is all behind. The mood here, yes, they'll argue over fish and all the rest of it. But ultimately, EU countries and the UK want to work together. EU countries and the UK, I mean, I say most EU countries because, of course, we could discuss Hungary and so on. But essentially, they look at the world and they worry about Russia. They worry that the United States is not as committed to European defence as it was before. They worry about China. They see it as a threat, but also as a country that they need. And it is a complicated world out there. So you can talk about bits of trade or fiddling around the edges and the UK's red lines that the Prime Minister says aren't going to be broken, not back into the customs union, not back into the single market. So you're never going to get rid of all of those trade barriers. But the important thing, I think, is the mood music and that the Starmer government and the EU want to make relations work.
And we shall see how many of the things they actually deliver, having just said that they're going to talk about what they want to deliver. Katya, lovely to catch up. See you again soon.
Bye.